Well, here we are, last week, week 12, looking at the last part of social stratification in Canada. We're going to focus predominantly on poverty in Canada. What is it? How do we define it? And we'll touch a bit on the social inequity in Canada in regards to how we support it, or how does it affect people in those poverty. So that is, who are they, demographically that is. And what does it affect in terms of their education, their employment opportunities, nutrition, and we'll look at the impact on children. And then we're going to touch on the theorists in terms of how do they view the role or the function or the purpose or the impact in explaining why does poverty exist. Given that in Canada since the year 2000, and then again in 2009, we've made commitments to eradicate poverty, and here we are in 2015, and we still have a high rate of poverty among children. I mean, given that it's an industrialized, developed country, you'd expect a different outcome from a commitment being made to lower the rate of poverty in Canada. So we'll look at those theorists and why do they explain the presence of poverty in Canada. All right, I hope you've enjoyed this semester. Please make sure that you continue to make notes. Be prepared, because the last test is almost here, and I'd love to see you guys all do just great and get your Gen Ed and have it be a success and have learned a lot about Canadian society. Good luck. It's been a pleasure to teach. I hope you've enjoyed this process, and those of you who I will see again next semester in one of my 2 online classes, I look forward to seeing you. Those of you who have chosen a different path, good luck. Enjoy and have a happy Christmas. Bye now.
Okay, we're going to look here is poverty in Canada, and there is what's known as, or at least we think there is, an official poverty line, and this is based on what is considered to be the minimum amount of money required for living at a subsistence level in Canada but Canada has no official definition of poverty. There's no official way of measuring poverty and no official poverty line. But when you think about the subsistence level, what kind of living is that going to be? So the exploration is to, figure out how do we just figure out what is the best way to measure, and the most accepted definition of poverty is through Statistics Canada before tax, and it's known as the low income cutoff. And this is the level at which a family can be in strained circumstances because it spends considerably more on the basic necessities of life, food, shelter, and clothing, than the average family. Now the key here is strained circumstances. Now this can vary from person to person, and it varies based on family size or community size. So according to the measure, any individual or family that spends more than 70% of its income on the necessities of life, food, clothing, and shelter, is considered to be living in poverty. Now the numbers in 2000 were low-income cutoff numbers. For a family of 4 was $18,920 for people living in the rural areas, and those living in cities it was $28,870. And you can see by the 2013 numbers, a family of 4, and this doesn't indicate whether or not it's rural or urban, it's probably an average, is $43,292. Now remember that that's going to calculate for food and shelter and clothing, and then about 70% of that $43,000 for the family of 4 goes towards that. And there's only whatever's left, a 30% left, to pay for personal care items, household needs, furniture, telephone, transportation, school supplies, health care, and so on and so on. There's no money for things like entertainment, recreation, reading material, insurance, or the ability to be able to donate or anything along those lines. So it makes it much more challenging for a family to exist in a way that is considered normal by most people's standards. So instead, we also look at, in Canada, 2 other terms that make sense, or at least are explored in terms of poverty. Sociologists look at distinguishing between absolute poverty. This is when people do not have the means to secure even the most basic necessities of life, food, shelter, and home. And then there's relative poverty. This is when people are able to afford basic necessities, but are still unable to maintain the average standard of living. So they might be using, food banks. They might be younger people who have taken on family responsibilities but don't have full-time employment. And so the question sometimes then ends up being, well, who are the poor? So when we look at age, gender, race and ethnicity, and disabilities, we start to determine a little bit about who are the poor. Children are about 17% of all children fall within the poor category. Now, of course, they don't make a living, but they are supported by families who may or may not make absolutely good livings. So that's about 1 million children living in poverty. The future of poor children doesn't look quite as bright, clearly. You look at gender, 2/3 of all adults living in poverty are women. The feminization of poverty is a trend in which women are disproportionately represented among people living in poverty. You look at race and ethnicity and disabilities, and you find where the bulk of what we would describe as our poor as far as the demographics are concerned. Now, there are economic and structural causes to poverty. This isn't all just because people are lazy or poor because they don't try very hard. There are other structural elements or economic elements that contribute to people being poor. Now, one of them is what's called deindustrialization. And when we think about economics, because about 50% of the poor are working poor, that means they have work, they're just not making as much money to pay for all what they need. It means that wages are much lower than the average cost of living. And this has increased over time. So structural issues could be international competition, automation, closure of many factories. And so this is where deindustrialization comes in. Corporations have been de-investing in Canada. They've been spreading out their manufacturing to other countries where it can be done cheaper. And millions of people have lost their jobs. An emergence of what is known as de-skilling. This is where there's a reduction of proficiency needed to perform the specific jobs. If it's in a line in a factory, either you do a very small amount of that and you don't need a great deal of skill to do it, or it's gotten more automated where less people are needed to do the job. And so there's been this reduction of in the wages for those jobs, and there's also been a shift from manufacturing to the service industry. Now, whatever the causes of poverty, there are consequences of this inequity. And these consequences can be affecting health, or they can be affecting education. And when you think in terms of health, well, the general consensus has been those with the most wealth also have the most health. And we found all kinds of different examples in terms of where the health issues are related to income. And when you think about the amount of food that someone might get and the quality of that food, you can see where it might impact education. And so in terms of education, the issue is abound. With the more wealth, you have more access, more chances for social mobility and your ability to move up from where you and your parents have been living to where maybe you might live in your future. And so these are very significant consequences. Now, in the Toronto paper a few years ago, there were a couple of things that were brought up. One was, what was the rate of type 2 diabetes in people in terms of income? And what you're noticing here is what they were measuring was activity friendliness, that is the proximity you have to being access to social activities and recreational activities, and factors that include things like crime and car ownership and proximity to stores. And they were also measuring health resources, the ease in which your neighborhood was for exercise, walking, and getting access to health care and getting access to food stores. And what they found was a pretty direct correlation between low-income people and where they were living and poor access to fresh foods, poor access to exercising opportunities, and poor access to healthcare providers. Also having poor access to the friendly enough neighborhoods by which to get out and do things. And so there was a direct relationship to where you were if you were living poor and what access you had to things that might help you be healthier. Now, in conjunction with that, another research study was done looking at what is the correlation between poverty and living in areas of pollution. And what you're seeing in this map is the correlation here. The high rates of poverty and pollution would be the shaded areas along with the dots representing high polluters, organizations, corporations, factories, and the shaded areas are low-income environments. And you see a fairly significant correlation between those living in poor neighborhoods along with those having higher rates of access to polluted environments. And you could say, well, that's purely accidental or coincidental, but it could also be argued that there's a certain degree of haves and have-nots, and what were we willing to do with people in lower incomes that we wouldn't do with people in upper incomes. Now we're going to look at some perspectives in this in terms of the functionalists. The Davis-Moore thesis, this was done in 1945. It still seems to have some appreciation till today. It claimed that social inequity was not only inevitable, but it was necessary for smooth functioning of society. Now that's a functionalist view. Slow changes, and the changes that do happen slowly for the best functioning of society. And his thesis was based on 5 points. The first being that all societies have important tasks that must be accomplished. Government, banking, the economy, family, education, religion, these are all important functions and tasks that all societies do and have to sort of make the society successful. The second point was that some positions are more important than others. Well, in an organization, not everybody can be a boss, so there are some people with higher level of responsibilities and others with lower levels of responsibilities in every society. That the most important positions must be filled by the most qualified. Now, you wouldn't take people with the lowest amount of education and put them in the highest degree of responsibility that requires the greatest responsibility for an organization. So typically, those with the highest skill level and the highest education get into these positions that have the most responsibility. Fourthly, these positions which require talent must be highly rewarded. You can't get people to do some of these jobs unless they're paid well. You look at some of these CEOs, they're making millions and millions of dollars. Well, they have a great deal of responsibility. Now, whether it's worth that or not is another thing, but that you can't attract them without that kind of money, apparently. And then fifth, that the most highly rewarded should be functionally unique and on which other positions rely for expertise, direction, and financing. So essentially saying that those who have those higher reward positions have with it expertise, have with it the delegative responsibility and the access to financing to make this this part of the society, this structure in society to function effectively and efficiently. Now, there's a special term in his area, and it's called meritocracy, which is a hierarchy in which all positions are rewarded based on people's ability and credentials. So the higher your responsibility and the higher your credentials, the higher rate of pay you get. The lower your credentials and the lower your ability, the less reward you get. Now, conflict theorists, on the other hand, their scholars don't believe that social inequity serves a motivating force for people. In fact, that they see it as a stratified system that is supported by Canadian ideology, Canadian laws, and the valorization of wealth. Valorization is really just the value we place on wealth, money, or groups of people. And so it can influence that valorization in terms of the value we place on wealth, power, and on whatever groups in which we may or may not discriminate against. So core values in Canada emphasize the importance of material possessions, hard work, individual initiative to get ahead, and behaviors that support the existing social structure. And so the difficulty then, of course, is not everybody has equal access to all of those things that reward getting ahead and the behaviors that support the existing structure. Not everyone has equal access either to resources like money, resources like food, shelter, and the ability, therefore, to be focused on the other goals that life in Canada we have as expectations. Now, the feminist perspective, the focus here is social inequities, but it also includes, within these social classes, it also includes an element that they call the double effect or the second shift. And this is where women have a tendency now, especially in today's environment, to be both working full-time, but then come home and end up carrying out a lot of the tasks that occur after work, looking after children, feeding the family, caretaking to the house, and looking after the elderly. The evidence of this is that women are still paid at a lower rate for the same position as men. Women's income on average is less than men's for the same positions, and this has been the case for some time. In fact, even with the Pay Equity Act of 1985, we still find that the disparity of income is quite significant. We do see shifts in the amount of time being spent in unpaid work, time with children, now versus the way it used to be. And there are some changes both for men and for women. We see in some of the new families being, younger families, that there's more equal division of responsibility after the work time. So when women become mothers, they often lose accumulated wealth and experience. Well, when you are working full time for a company and then you take time off to raise children and have children, then you're out of the potential of getting benefits, support, and towards your pension plan. So there's less accumulated wealth, and you don't get the experience of working while others are working and you're at home looking after family. And then lastly, the symbolic interactionalists. The focus is at the micro level. And so they're looking more at not so much on these larger structures. And their methodology is using qualitative research methods. So they do studies and look at wealthy businessmen, and look at lower income people. And they find that wealthier businessmen tend to keep together and are bound together through games, rituals, and sharing meals and other activities. Now, it doesn't mean that they sort of do this as a source and as a methodology, but they do tend to create these sort of circumstances which they can continue to participate together and solidify their position, if you will, start to have a group think, if you recall that term, where everyone starts to think alike and starts to see that what they're doing is right in spite of there being some areas that they could improve. Now, symbolic interactionists also describe a term called deference, and this is where researchers have found that the wealthy often demand deference from lower class people. Now, whether that is in terms of bowing or keeping your head down or keeping at a lower level, you'll notice that when people in the streets are begging for money, oftentimes they're seated or on the ground because somehow that gets the best reward, and that would be an example of deference. This type of ceremonial activity often functions as a symbolic means whereby appreciation is regularly conveyed to a recipient. So these theories are just one way of looking at the different ways that poverty exists or is maintained, or how we view poverty. So I hope that this has been a helpful lesson looking at social stratification. This is the last segment of Sociology 1. I hope you've enjoyed it, and good luck in the new year, and Merry Christmas. Bye now.